They thought she was invisible. A woman behind barbed wire, malnourished, barefoot, watched by guards who believed fear had already broken her. To them, she was harmless. To the camp, she was becoming something far more dangerous. What the Japanese guards inside this specific prison camp never understood was that they had just handed her the most powerful weapon in war. Being underestimated. If you enjoy deeply human war stories like this, consider subscribing. By 1943, the Pacific War had turned merciless. Island by island, the fighting was savage, intimate, and unforgiving. Surrender was rare. Capture was worse. Japanese military doctrine viewed prisoners of war as having forfeited honor itself, and women, especially foreign women, were seen as fragile, compliant, incapable of resistance. The camp sat deep in the humid jungle, far from headlines or oversight. Bamboo barracks sagged under monsoon rain. Disease moved faster than guards. Prisoners woke each morning unsure who would still be alive by nightfall. Food was measured in spoonfuls. Punishment was public and unpredictable. Among the captured was a woman the guards barely noticed, not because she hid, but because they never bothered to look. She had been taken months earlier during the chaos of retreat. Her records were incomplete. No rank, no obvious authority. Just another prisoner, marked female, dismissed as weak. The guards assigned her menial tasks, carrying water, cleaning latrines, tending the sick. They believed this would break her. Instead, it gave her access. She listened. She watched. She learned patterns. Which guard drank too much, which one cut corners, which shifts overlapped just long enough to create blind spots. She memorized routines the way soldiers memorize maps, quietly, patiently. At night, she whispered. At first, it was harmless. Comfort, reassurance, reminders that survival itself was an act of resistance. Then the whispers changed. Information began to move. News from one barrack to another. Which prisoners were strongest? Which were near collapse? Who could be trusted? She never raised her voice. She never took credit. Leadership in that camp looked nothing like command. It looked like listening. The guards never questioned it. Their worldview didn't allow for it. Women didn't organize revolts. Prisoners didn't think strategically. Desperation erased intelligence, or so they believed. But she had already identified the camp's greatest weakness: isolation. The prisoners were meant to feel alone, cut off from one another, from hope, from coordination. And for months, it worked. Until she began stitching them back together. Messages moved through laundry baskets. Food scraps carried signals. A cough meant one thing, a folded cloth meant another. Simple, elegant, impossible to detect unless you believed something was happening at all. And the guards didn't. As weeks passed, something subtle changed. Prisoners stood a little straighter. Eye contact lasted longer. Fear was still there, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. The woman understood the risk. Discovery wouldn't mean punishment. It would mean execution for her and anyone connected to her. But by then, the question had already shifted. This was no longer about escape. It was about control. The camp commander was under pressure of his own. Supplies were short. Morale among the guards was deteriorating. Discipline slipped. Orders were enforced unevenly. He dismissed warnings from subordinates who sensed unrest. Prisoners, he believed, were too exhausted to resist. Moments like this changed history. Hit like so, this story reaches more people. Then came the incident. A work detail returned one man short. The guards assumed collapse. Death was routine. But inside the barracks, the absence triggered something else. A countdown. The woman moved faster now. Instructions passed in fragments. No full plan existed in any one place. If one person was caught, the rest could continue. She had learned that from watching the guards. The night the rain came, it was heavy, loud enough to mask footsteps, constant enough to dull attention. Lanterns burned low. Sentinels sought shelter, and for the first time since the camp was built, the prisoners moved not as individuals, but as a unit. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't chaos. It was coordination. Tools disappeared. Gates were tested. The fire broke out in the far corner, small, controlled, deliberate. Guards ran toward it, exactly as expected. What happened next shattered every assumption the camp had ever relied on. The guards didn't understand what they were seeing. Prisoners acting with intent, with timing, with purpose. Orders collided. Shots rang out into the dark, striking nothing but rain and trees, and in the confusion, the woman did the one thing they never imagined possible. She stepped into the open, not to fight, to signal. A single movement, rehearsed 100 times, triggered the final phase. Men rushed, barracks emptied. The camp, designed to contain, became impossible to control. The realization hit the guards too late. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising, this was organized. And it had been happening under their noses the entire time. By dawn, the camp would never be the same. Some prisoners would vanish into the jungle, others would pay a brutal price, and the woman, the one they thought was harmless, would force the Japanese command to confront a truth that it refused to see. That intelligence does not wear uniforms, that leadership does not announce itself, and that underestimating human will can be fatal. By sunrise, the camp was unrecognizable. Smoke hung low over the bamboo roofs. One watchtower leaned at an unnatural angle, its ladder splintered. The guards redrooped in confusion, counting heads that refused to stay still. Prisoners who had been shadows days before were suddenly gone, swallowed by jungle, darkness, and rain. Others hadn't made it. Some were cut down during the chaos. Some collapsed just beyond the wire, bodies found days later by patrols. The revolt had never promised survival, only agency. And for many, that alone had been worth the risk. The woman understood this better than anyone. She hadn't fled with the first wave. She stayed behind, just long enough to ensure the signals had gone through, just long enough to draw attention away from the weakest runners. When the guards finally realized where the coordination had originated, they were too late to stop what mattered. The camp commander demanded answers. Interrogations followed. Beatings. Executions meant to reassert control. But the structure she had built was already dissolving, intentionally. No single prisoner could betray the whole, because no one had ever known it all. That was the brilliance of it. The Japanese command would later describe the revolt as unexpected, a breakdown of discipline, a failure of vigilance. What they never put into writing was the deeper truth. Their own assumptions had blinded them. They had looked at a female prisoner and seen weakness. What they failed to see was adaptability. In the weeks that followed, the camp tightened into something harsher than before. Rations were cut, movements restricted, punishments escalated, but something essential had been lost. Fear no longer flowed in just one direction. Prisoners had learned that the guards could be confused, that systems could be disrupted, that obedience was not inevitable. And the guards had learned something else. That intelligence didn't always announce itself with rank or force. The woman was eventually identified, not through proof, but through inference. Survivors spoke of her quietly. Guards noticed who others looked to during moments of uncertainty. Leadership leaves traces, even when it hides. Her punishment was severe. Records are fragmentary. Some accounts say she was executed publicly, used as an example to crush further resistance. Others suggest she was transferred, isolated, interrogated by officers who could not reconcile her actions with their worldview. What is certain is this: she was never again underestimated. News of the revolt traveled farther than the camp ever expected. Escaped prisoners reached Allied lines months later, emaciated, sick, but alive. Their testimony altered how intelligence officers understood Japanese prison camps, not just as places of suffering, but as pressure vessels, unstable, vulnerable, human. Allied planners adjusted. Supplies were dropped in the unknown camps. Reconnaissance increased. Psychological warfare units took note of how fragile command structures could become when belief collapsed. The revolt didn't end the war. It didn't save everyone, but it mattered. Because history is not only shaped by generals and armies, it is shaped by moments when ordinary people refuse the roles assigned to them. The guards had believed the camp was controlled by walls, guns, and fear. The woman understood something else entirely. The control lives in perception, and once perception breaks, everything else follows. In the decades after the war, her name surfaced only occasionally, in footnotes, in survivor interviews, in fragments passed down by those who had seen her move through the camp like a quiet current, changing direction without warning. She never sought recognition, and history, for a long time, didn't offer it. But her story forces an uncomfortable question, not just about war, but about leadership itself. How many turning points are missed because someone is dismissed? How many failures begin with the belief that power only looks one way? The Japanese guards believed they understood their prisoners. They believed they understood women. They believed they understood control. They were wrong on all three counts. And in that mistake, that single fatal misjudgment, a camp designed to erase individuality, became the stage for one of the most quietly defiant acts of the Pacific War. Share the story with someone who thinks World War II outcomes were inevitable. What lingers most about her story is not the violence of that night, but the silence that came after. When the war ended, files were burned, camps were dismantled, officers wrote reports that emphasized weather, shortages, miscommunication, anything but misjudgment. The revolt became a paragraph, then a sentence, then a footnote, and finally, in many official records, nothing at all. But memory does not follow orders. Among survivors, her presence endured in details that refused to fade. The way she spoke softly, so guards would never hear urgency in her voice. The way she remembered names when starvation made people feel interchangeable. The way she never framed resistance as heroism, only as necessity. Years later, psychologists studying captivity would describe the phenomenon she instinctively understood. The control collapses fastest when those without power stop seeing themselves as powerless. She didn't give the prisoners weapons, she gave them belief, not in victory, but in choice. That distinction matters. The Japanese guards had relied on a rigid hierarchy, officer over soldier, man over woman, captor over captive. It worked only as long as everyone accepted the script. The moment she rewrote her role, the entire structure became unstable. Leadership failure rarely announces itself with explosions. More often, it begins quietly, with assumptions left unchallenged. Assumptions like, women do not organize, prisoners do not think, fear is permanent. Those beliefs shaped guard behavior more than any written order. They created blind spots, and blind spots in war are lethal. Historians today still debate the precise outcome of the revolt. How many escaped? How many were recaptured? How many were recaptured? How many paid the price later? In ways never recorded. What is beyond debate is that the camp was never the same, and neither were the people who lived through it. Some survivors carried guilt for decades. Others carried pride. Most carried a complicated mixture of both. Resistance, they would later say, did not feel brave in the moment. It felt inevitable, because once you see a crack in the wall, pretending it isn't there becomes impossible. The woman herself remains elusive. No photograph has been conclusively identified. No grave bears her confirmed name. In a war obsessed with documentation, she exists primarily through impact rather than image. And perhaps that is fizzing. She did not seek to be remembered. She sought to change what was happening. Now, not later. Her defiance was not loud. It did not rely on strength. It relied on awareness, on seeing the system clearly and understanding where it was weakest. The Japanese guards believed they were guarding bodies. She understood she was guarding something else entirely. The idea that even in the most controlled environments imaginable, human beings retain the ability to decide who they are. That idea survived the camp. It survived the war. And it forces us, decades later, to reconsider how history actually moves. Not always through sweeping offensives or famous speeches, but through quiet acts of leadership that never make it into textbooks, acts born from being ignored, underestimated, dismissed, because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one thinks to watch. And sometimes the course of history bends not because someone had power, but because someone refused to believe they had none. Long after the last shots of the Pacific War faded, investigators tried to categorize what had happened inside camps like this one. They searched for patterns, shortages, disease, command breakdowns. What they struggled to measure was something far less tangible: the moment fear stopped working the way it was supposed to. Because fear, when absolute, paralyzes. But fear, once questioned, becomes unstable. The revolt, organized by a woman the guards barely acknowledged, did not emerge from strength. It emerged from observation, from patience, from understanding people, captors and captives alike, as human beings governed by habits, blind spots, and pride. That is why the event unsettled Japanese officers more than they admitted, not because prisoners fought back, but because the structure meant to crush resistance had been quietly inverted. The very roles designed to enforce obedience had created opportunity. The guards believed authority flowed downward. She proved it could leak sideways. In post-war interviews, some former guards spoke defensively, insisting no revolt could have succeeded without external interference. Others dismissed the prisoners as lucky. A few, more honest than most, admitted something else entirely, that they never imagined a woman could coordinate men under such conditions. That admission matters. War magnifies existing beliefs. It does not create prejudice. It weaponizes it. And in this case, the weapon turned inward. Modern military historians now point to stories like hers when discussing asymmetric resistance, how power structures fail when they rely too heavily on stereotype rather than assessment. Her actions prefigured ideas later formalized in resistance doctrine, decentralized leadership, compartmentalized information, morale as a strategic asset. She didn't study these principles, she lived them. What makes her story enduring is not that it is unique, but that it is repeated quietly across history. In occupied cities, in prison blocks, in labor camps, whenever someone sees what others refuse to see and acts without waiting for permission. The tragedy is that such figures are often remembered last, if at all. Because history prefers simplicity, named battles, clear heroes, defined victories. Her legacy resists that. There was no clean ending, no triumphant return, only consequences. Some immediate, some unfolding slowly over years and lives forever altered. But for those who survived, one truth remained unshaken. They were not powerless. That knowledge followed them home. It shaped how they spoke to their children, how they remembered the war, how they understood authority itself. Many said later that captivity taught them more about leadership than any uniform ever could. And at the center of that lesson stood a woman history almost erased, not because she lacked importance, but because she never fit the story war wanted to tell about itself. She reminds us that leadership is not granted, it is assumed, and that sometimes the most decisive moments of war happen not on battlefields, but in places designed to strip people of choice, when someone quietly decides otherwise. In the end, the guards were right about one thing: she was dangerous. Just not for the reasons they ever imagined. There is one final detail survivors returned to again and again, long after the war was over. They said she never spoke about victory, even on the night of the revolt, even when the wire was breached and the guards were shouting into the rain. She did not frame what they were doing as winning. She framed it as deciding not to disappear quietly, deciding not to let the camp define the limits of their minds. That mindset mattered more than escape itself, because most prisoners understood the odds. The jungle was unforgiving. Patrols were relentless. Survival beyond the wire was never guaranteed. But remaining inside, forever obedient, was a certainty of slow erasure. She recognized something many commanders never do: people will endure almost anything if they believe it has meaning. Take meaning away, and even the strongest body collapses. The Japanese guards had mastered physical control. What they never mastered was psychological legitimacy. Their authority depended entirely on fear, and fear, once challenged, decays rapidly. After the revolt, even prisoners who never attempted escape behaved differently. They asked questions. They delayed compliance. They watched the guards with the same calculating attention that had once been reserved for them. Power had shifted. Not completely, but irreversibly. For historians, this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it forces us to admit that war outcomes are not shaped only by strategy rooms and battlefield maneuvers. They are shaped in kitchens, barracks, prison yards, wherever human beings interpret the meaning of their circumstances. And meaning, unlike weapons, cannot be confiscated. The woman's story also challenges how we talk about resistance itself. Popular narratives favor explosive heroism, guns blazing, flags raised, enemies defeated. Her resistance was quieter, slower, almost invisible. And yet, it may have been more effective. She understood that survival was not binary, that even failure could plant something enduring. But if only a handful escaped, if only one guard questioned his assumptions, if only one prisoner carried the lesson forward, the effort had not been wasted. That is not desperation, that is strategy. In that sense, her actions ripple far beyond the camp. They force us to reconsider how many so-called inevitable outcomes in history were, in fact, contingent on belief, on who was seen as capable. and who was ignored. The guards believed the camp was secure because it looked secure. She saw the truth beneath the surface: exhaustion, complacency, overconfidence. The same flaws that undo armies also undo prisons. The difference is scale, not nature. Today, museums display uniforms, weapons, and maps from the Pacific War. But stories like hers rarely occupy central space. They are harder to frame, harder to dramatize, harder to conclude neatly. Yet they may be the most honest stories of all, because they remind us that history is not only written by those who issue orders, but by those who quietly decide which orders no longer apply. She left no manifesto, no final speech, no recorded declaration of intent. What she left instead was proof. Proof that leadership does not require permission. Proof that intelligence is not bound by gender or status. Proof that even in the most controlled environments, systems fail when they stop seeing people clearly. And perhaps that is why her story still unsettles, because it asks a question that reaches beyond World War II, beyond camps, beyond uniforms, beyond war itself. Who are we underestimating right now, and what are they already changing while no one is watching?